Welcome to the Happy Mindset. Today's episode is episode number 58, and today's episode title is called Action Creates Confidence. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how action ultimately outmaneuvers and outpowers confidence. I want to talk about this because for a long time I assumed that in order to do something you have to be confident before you do it. So in order to do a podcast, I thought you needed to have great interview skills. I thought you needed to be really confident in your ability in order to do that, in order to allow yourself to do that. So I've just realized that over time, from doing things like learning computer programming, learning foreign languages, doing this podcast, I've never felt fully equipped to do any of this stuff. I've just kind of figured it out as I went along, and from doing that I've realized that the confidence doesn't come from creating an idea of yourself before the fact, of trying to build yourself up in such a way that you can do it. For a long time I thought that that's the way you needed to do things. I thought that you needed to be confident in yourself so you come across to other people as being really confident. But I found that action is the key to confidence. And I've also found that over time that a lot of people talk a lot, but they don't actually act and follow up on things. And you start seeing that over time as you take more consistent action in your life. You start realizing how few people actually do that. They commit to something and they take action regardless of the outcome. So when you do that, you've got less competition for yourself as well in the long term in what you want to do. So my message is, don't wait to be confident. You're not going to be confident from trying to build your confidence. It'll come from getting clear on what you want to do and taking action regardless. So the more that you can get comfortable with the uncomfortable emotions that come up. Sometimes I feel uncomfortable sitting here talking into a podcast. I kind of make this stuff up on the fly based off of the lessons I've learned over the years, and I just kind of talk it out, and I actually start learning a bit from talking it out myself, seeing what actually makes sense, because I make more of an effort when I'm speaking on a podcast to try and make things coherent and logical, whereas I wouldn't make as much of an effort when I'm just walking around myself in my own world every day. So it helps me to solidify things better that way. So with the action and confidence, so what you really want to do is just take action on things and learn as you go along. So again, I've been very suspect to black and white thinking. So I used to hear one message and think that was right until I realized that it wasn't fully right, and I'd listen to another message and think that was right, and then I realized, no, there's something missing here too, until I realized it's a combination of the two. So when it comes to action, the important thing is to learn as you take action. So like, you're not going to be great starting off at something. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, and it's from the action that you get real world feedback, and you're going to improve based on that real world feedback. If you don't do that, you're living in a vacuum. You're not getting any feedback, so there's no path forward. So it's difficult to take action on things when you're a novice, when you're a beginner, and you're going to make a lot of mistakes. It requires humility, which isn't always easy, but by being clear on why you're doing it. So if you've got a very strong why for doing something, then you will have the humility to learn the lessons you need to learn to get to the next level and the next level and the next level. So I've learned that from the combination of action and learning, that helps you to move forward. You might be moving forward at a snail's pace sometimes, or you might feel like you're not making any progress, but I guarantee you are. If you're showing up every day, if you're taking action, if you've got an open mind, if you're willing to change things around, then you will start to figure things out over time. So just even taking this podcast, for example, when I started doing this podcast, it was very vague and very broad, and I suppose there's an argument that it is quite vague and quite broad still, but it's a lot more specific now than it was at the start. And at the start, I can remember I wanted to get very clear on things, because it was very hard for me to describe what the podcast was about for a long time. So if anybody asked me about my podcast, I would find it very difficult to explain what exactly it was. Nowadays I can say to people it's about human psychology, skills development and happiness. But that came from almost 2 years of doing the podcast and realizing who are the types of people that I seem to be attracting to the podcast, who are the types of people I like talking to, what are the lessons I'm learning here, what are the common themes that are emerging here. So all that was learned through the action part. So if I didn't have the action part, I would have never learned that stuff. If I tried to build myself up confidence-wise beforehand, I would have tried to go with the advice that other people who seemed more confident than me were saying, and then I would have gotten to a stage where I wouldn't have been fully involved in this. It wouldn't have been a project that I that I show up every day regardless of the outcome because it's something that I'm passionate about, something that I actually love doing. I wouldn't get that from somebody telling me to do this, this and this before the fact. So there are some things that I've learned over time. So these are very helpful for somebody who's a generalist. So you've got a lot of different interests and you're wondering how you combine them. My piece of advice is to start taking action. So right now in my path, I have got a career as a computer programmer. I'm doing a podcast and I'm writing a book. And that all came from years of experimenting with a lot of different stuff. And during that process, I enjoyed it, but a lot of times too, I was kind of wondering what's going to come of all this. I'm being too broad, and it's not going to go anywhere. But I'm glad that I persevered, even though it took years to get to this point, and it's going to take another years and years for me to get to another point. But I'm glad I persevered because this variety is what actually suits my personality. It suits what I enjoy doing. I like talking to different people. If this was just a podcast for programming or a podcast just for languages, I would get quite bored with it. I wouldn't find much depth or meaning to it. But because there's other elements that are going on in this podcast, it engages me all the time, and I know that it can always change. And so one thing I'm doing right now, off the back of being in the process of writing a book, I met Davey. Davey's his name, give him a shout out. And he's an illustrator, so he's helping to do illustrations in my book now that I didn't envision before the fact. But it was from me writing the book that at the end of it, Lisa Caprelli, who's helping me to get the book published, she mentioned Davey was a guy who illustrates books, and he illustrated for a woman called Elizabeth Jurado, who will also be on the podcast soon to talk about her book and the process she went on. But I met him from taking action and from saying yes to Lisa as well. It's important to say yes to things even if you don't feel ready. With my programming job, I said yes to it even though I didn't feel ready. With the book, I said yes to it even though I don't feel ready. But I know that these things are important to me, and they're things that I have a sense of achievement and accomplishment, that I actually have done these things, that they fill me with pride and happiness. And it's from the taking the action part that I've grown to learn about this. So anyway, with Davey, so I mentioned Davey there. Davey, I also want to include more of his artwork in my podcast because it just ties into my own personal story that I write about in my book, about wanting to be a cartoonist. When I was younger, I can remember wanting to be a cartoonist and the world telling me no. That was the first time I realized that you can't be what you want to be. But that wasn't entirely true. It took a long time for me to start realizing that other people don't fully determine your destiny or your future if you have the courage to look within and start looking at yourself and your own part in the world. That's what this podcast is about, empowering you to do that, and for myself as well, to empower me to do that more as well, to remind me to do that. So those are the types of lessons that I've learned from taking action, getting real world feedback, adjusting. It's a messy process. You learn a lot. It's a messy process, but it also keeps me on my toes. So sometimes it's a roller coaster of emotion. You don't really know what you're doing. That's kind of the experience when you don't know what you're doing and you're learning on the fly. You do feel on your toes, and you do feel you're going through a lot of different emotions. But the flip side to that is that I can remember how I used to live was just very kind of numb. I used to just accept my lot in life, and I can remember I'd just be like, what's this all for, in the back of my mind, and I would never allow myself to actually put that out there. It was more coming from I suppose the tone was, or the feeling was, the sensation was that what's the point? There's no meaning, there's no purpose to life. What's the point of even trying? It's pointless. So that was a very hollow experience, and the alternative though was to follow this path, which is more of a roller coaster. Don't really know what I'm doing sometimes, but I'm figuring it out. And those emotions that are uncomfortable to feel and to learn from, that's part of that process. So I'd rather be feeling alive with the flip side of emotions that it can be overwhelming sometimes, or you get feeling a bit lost, rather than living in a sedative, numbing manner of the way I used to live. So that's from taking real world action, following your own thing, take on board people's advice, but there's a thing you want to do, so follow that, trust that, take on other people's advice, get feedback, but go with what you want to create in the world, because that will sustain for the long term, and it'll also be something, regardless of the outcome, you'll be proud that you showed up and you did something that you felt that actually mattered. So that's the message for today. I hope you learned something from this podcast. It's a little bit random, but it's some of the lessons that I have been learning that have been useful to me, and I want to impart them for you as well, to pick up on a few things as well that might help you along your path as a generalist and as somebody who wants to make your own unique impact in the world. So thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Until next time, have fun and enjoy the process.